that the state was actually licensing wastes, industrial waste, to be used as fertilizers. In this case, this is an Alcoa waste from the manufacturer of aluminum that is being marketed for its magnesium content. It's being marketed as a liming agent. The only problem with it is it's 42% chloride, which is salts, right, and 5% fluoride. And so the concern in this letter, as we found out, was that, you know, if it were going to be land applied, it couldn't be put where any horses or cows were going to graze because of dental fluorosis that the fluoride would cause. But Dennis found documents like this, and I mean document after document, that the state was involved in licensing, registering industrial waste to be used as fertilizers across the state.
Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Neva Hassanen, and I'm in the Faculty of Environmental Studies here at the university, and I appreciate you all coming out. I know it's a busy time of year for many folks, and some of these first spring evenings are hard to resist, so thanks. I'm happy to introduce Patty Martin, who's the founder of an organization called Safe Food and Fertilizer. But we're going to hear a lot tonight about the history behind her creating this organization, the work that she's been doing over the last decade to uncover some practices in the United States that I find frankly startling and remarkable. And that is the practice of moving hazardous waste into products, including fertilizer, that are spread not only on farm fields, but also in many people's backyards, maybe the Oval, for all I know. And this is a practice that many people did not know about until Patty and a small group of farmers in the Quincy, Washington area exposed it. They began to piece together some things that seemed odd to them. And, you know, many people thought, oh, you know, you must be crazy. But in fact, what she's shown, and others now have corroborated, that this practice is fairly widespread. The story starts in Quincy, Washington, but actually it's something that happens throughout the country and perhaps the world. Patty had some help in her effort, and that was by a guy named Duff Wilson, who's an investigative reporter at the Seattle Times. And I know we've got a lot of journalism students here tonight, and I'm glad you're here, because reporting and fair and accurate reporting of what is happening in our society is so important. Freedom of the press is just absolutely essential. And Duff Wilson's hard work to expose this practice of hazardous waste going into fertilizers and road de-icers and other products, as well as the work of citizens in Quincy that Patty exemplified, is really important. Wilson wrote a series of articles in the Seattle Times called Fear in the Fields, and then that series was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and he was a finalist for the Pulitzer. He's since written a book called Fateful Harvest, which is, here I have my prop, which is based on those stories and expands on them. And we learn a lot about the community of Quincy through this book. Many of the students in our program have read, and others as well. So without stealing much more of the thunder, because Patty can obviously tell the story much better than I can about what's happened, and I've asked her tonight to really tell us what happened in Quincy and how it connects to this wider pattern. I'll just say that in the day that I've had to spend with Patty, I'm really struck by what a brave woman she is. She raised questions in her community about a pattern of practices that really were not popular questions, to say the least. And she really went up against the town fathers, if you will. She was mayor of Quincy at the time. She's a mother of 4 children. She speaks eloquently about the effects of these practices on children's health, on our food supply that we all eat. And I'm just, struck by her bravery and her willingness to raise serious questions. I think it's an inspiration to all of us to do that in our day-to-day lives as well. So thank you for coming. Help me welcome Patty Martin.
That's right on? Thank you. Gosh, now I hope I live up to the expectations that have been set here. I too would like to thank you for coming out. And I want to, before we begin on the history of what happened in Quincy, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, okay? I grew up in a military family. We traveled around the country from the time I was born until I was in 4th grade. And my dad retired in 1963 as a lieutenant colonel, and his goal was to have all 7 of us children graduate from the same high school. Okay, I have 4 older brothers, and I have 2 younger sisters. I jokingly refer to myself as the 5th boy, okay? I think a lot of the fun and games we had as kids growing up, resulted in a lot of the athletic prowess that I have. I played high school basketball and then 4 years at Gonzaga University, where I got a Bachelor of Science in Biology and almost a minor in chemistry, and then a year overseas in Sweden. My dad's goal of having us all graduate from the same high school happened when we settled in Quincy, and all 7 children who were born within a 10-year period of each other graduated from Quincy High School, all with honors or above. And I have to say that I had an outstanding childhood, and my folks, I come by my volunteerism and my belief in this government through the example set by my folks. To sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards of men. Now, Abraham Lincoln said this regarding the abolition of slavery, okay? But all through the course of history, things have changed because of the involvement of people in the democratic process, right? Women's suffrage, the vote of the blacks in 1968, all of those happened because people rose up and said, it's time, okay? It's time for a change. Now, Neva's kind of led you to believe that I'm the hero of the story, and I really want to introduce you to Dennis DeYoung, who is actually, in my opinion, the hero of this story. Dennis did something that no other farmer who has faced crop failures and suspected his fertilizer has ever done, and that is he stood. Okay, he stood up, refused an offer by Cenex to compensate him for the damage on his land, refused to turn the water onto his land, instead giving his farm up to the chemical company that had damaged his farm. The story about how I should just leave him up there for a minute, because he's not featured in the book, and all of you that have read the book, you need to get a real good look at Dennis. Let me ask you, how many have read Fateful Harvest? I've already determined that about half of you are here because it's a mandatory attendance. But I first met Dennis after I moved back to town in 1987, I became involved in overseeing the city government. Okay, I was very suspicious of many of the activities that the local electeds had on their agenda, including a purchase of 1,600 acres 5 miles south of Quincy. They were going to spray the effluent from Lamb Weston and Simplot on the 1,600 acres, and the location made absolutely no sense. I mean, it was way the heck out there. They were going to have to put in lift stations. They were paying 3 times the going rate for the property. And I mean, just none of it added up. And someone said, well, you ought to talk to Dennis DeYoung. He thinks his land's been contaminated. And it was just like this light bulb went on. It was like, holy cow, that's what's happened. The property's contaminated and they're trying to cover it up. So I gave Dennis a call, and sure enough, he had been communicating with one of the farmers on this property, and they had been comparing crop damages. Okay, they had had similar crop damages when all of a sudden, the farmer that Dennis was talking to stopped talking. The city had put options on his land, and this man was no longer going to talk about any damages to his property, right? You wouldn't do that either if your land was potentially going to be bought for 3 times its going rate. okay? So Dennis told me a story about how his land had been contaminated by Cenex, and that Cenex, who was a local fertilizer company, had what they called a rinsate pond, and I apologize that this is going to come out and, we're going to have to see it in two pieces here. Yeah, there we go. Cenex had this rinsate pond, and I have to kind of describe to you what this rinsate pond is, but it's the size of a small swimming pool. It was 52 feet long, 36 feet wide, and 5 feet deep. It could hold, if the calculations are correct, around 63,000 gallons of materials. And what a rinsate pond is, the fertilizer companies will go out to the fields with either big nurse trucks, or they'll go out with applicator tanks, and they bring these applicator tanks and they rinse them out with water, triple rinse them, and this material was held in the rinsate pond because it's illegal to dump these things on the ground, right? That's kind of an irony there, isn't it? Anyway, held in this rinsate pond, and over time this material accumulates. They've put an aeration system on it, and it's blowing across onto school property, killing trees, and eventually there's 30,000 gallons of this sludge left, okay? We got the EPA to come in 1993, and these were some of the materials that were found in that rinsate pond. Beryllium, cadmium, and chromium were the top three. They're all at levels that exceed cleanup standards. There's many things on this list: lead, titanium, thallium, arsenic, none of which has any relationship, has any value in crops whatsoever, okay? Going into all of this, I'll tell you, I knew nothing about what was necessary for crops to grow, nor was I an expert on hazardous waste. This just wasn't on my agenda to grow up and be a hazardous waste and fertilizer expert. But this material was dumped on Dennis's property, and it killed the crop. He had a corn crop on it that year, which I should mention, his land, he was not farming his land that year. He had leased his land out. And Cenex had paid the man that was leasing Dennis's property, they had paid him $16,000 to take the contents of this pit. Eventually, Cenex would be taken to court, and I show this to you just to get a handle on this. We have approximately 38,000 gallons of product to dispose of. Which way do I need to go? Okay. If we haul it, this liquid, to Arlington Chemical Disposal in Arlington, Oregon, we'll be required to dry it down to dry matter. This would result in 500 tons. The cost of drying this liquid, and the notes of the disposal of it, would be $170,000. Okay, it would have cost them $170,000 to dispose of this material legally, but instead what they did was they paid a farmer to take it and saved $144,000. Okay? When I first met Dennis, the first thing I said to him, Dennis, is whatever you do, don't settle out of court, okay? Because people have a right to know. You don't know how many farmers have come before you that have had similar crop problems and have settled out of court, okay? And right from the very beginning, I don't know how much you know about waste disposal in this country, but waste disposal is big business, okay? It's multi-billions and probably trillions of dollars. And I just lost my train of thought there, I apologize. I could see that someone could contaminate a person's farm and still, make up the difference to them for the crop damage and still make money. Okay, do you understand that? And so this is an example of it. $16,000 to pay someone to dispose of this on Dennis's farm versus properly disposing of it for $170,000. And Dennis wasn't alone. Eventually there'll be two other farmers that will come aboard who have similar problems. Duke Giroux with his onions, no matter how much water he put on them, they just kept burning up. And Tom Whitty with his alfalfa, it was streaked just like the crops that Dennis had seen, and was comparing notes with this man south of town. And when he fed that alfalfa to his cows got cancers and died. He had to put a large part of his herd down. Dennis's corn crop, I should tell you, I saw pictures of it because the crop, by the time I met Dennis, the crop was already out of the field. But the stalks were very short, dwarfed, There were multiple ears on the stalks, and the tassels were blood red. And there were many places on the ground where nothing would grow but nightshade. Okay, the next year, Cenex, let me take a step back here. When Cenex offered to make this up to Dennis, they wanted him to turn the water on, and Dennis refused. And at that point, he walked away from his land. Well, Cenex took over his property, okay, valued about $450,000, and they turned the water on. And they put 100 acre-feet of water on that property the next year to flush these contaminants out into the lake below. And one of the crop they grew the very next year was Sudan grass. And the Sudan grass was then fed to a neighbor's horses whose mares ulcerated, the foal were aborted, and Ruth Ann Keith eventually had to put her horses down, and that's a very nasty thing to do because horses live for very long lives, and you become very attached to animals like that. So that's kind of a history of the things we were starting to see, and I should tell you that all during this, records were being made, such as Ruth Ann's, complaints being received. That's not a very good one, but this documents what was happening to our horses. All the time, this was being reported to the state, okay? And never once, in all the time we would talk to the state, which is 6 years, would anyone say to us, yes, hazardous waste goes into fertilizer, okay? Nor would they deny that it was happening either. They just, it was like we were crazy. Like we were making the story up. Well, when Dennis lost his property, an interesting thing happened. Dennis was preparing to bring a lawsuit against Cenex, and Cenex instead filed a summary judgment against Dennis. Okay, no basis for it, claiming he owed them $250,000, even though he had turned his land over to them. And to some people's surprise, although I wasn't entirely surprised, Cenex won. And at that point, this is 1993, Dennis has lost his farm, okay, is in debt now to Cenex for $250,000. And he has to resort to driving around the state, driving feed, animal feed around the state to different locations. And what Dennis did, because Dennis is a fighter. What Dennis did was he stopped into the Department of Ag, he stopped into the Department of Ecology, he stopped in at the courthouses, he stopped in at the libraries, and Dennis is dyslexic. Okay, so this is a real effort for Dennis to go in and review these documents. And then as he would gather them, he would bring them to me, and I would review them. And this is just an example of one of the documents where we were able to piece together that the state was actually licensing wastes, industrial waste, to be used as fertilizers. In this case, this is an Alcoa waste from the manufacturer of aluminum that is being marketed for its magnesium content. It's being marketed as a liming agent. The only problem with it is it's 42% chloride, which is salts, right, and 5% fluoride. And so the concern in this letter, as we found out, was that if it were going to be land applied, it couldn't be put where any horses or cows were going to graze because of dental fluorosis that the fluoride would cause. But Dennis found documents like this, and I mean document after document, that the state was involved in licensing, registering industrial waste to be used as fertilizers across the state. Well, I have to kind of make the whole story kind of short, okay? And so you're going to get 7 years in a very short period of time. About the same time I'm meeting Dennis, I've already got myself a reputation in town for being what I describe as Ralph Nader of the city council. I'm the watchdog. And one of my classmates contacted me in the summer of 1992, and she said, "I want you running for council, Patty." And I said, Carmen, I am not running for city council. She says, yeah, I want you running for council. I don't want you just running for council, I want you running for the big one, for mayor. And it's like, Carmen, I am not running for office. I've got babies at home. She said, well, I'm going to call you every month from now, until the filing period, and, get you to run for mayor. And she was true to her word. She called me every month. Well, have you decided yet? Are you running? It's like, no, Carmen, I'm not running. I've got babies at home, right? Well, just remember, you too can be the mayor next year if you follow my lead here. 10 minutes to 5 on the last day of the filing period, right? 10 minutes to 5 on Friday, the last day you can file for public office. Nobody has filed for mayor, and there are 3 city council positions open, okay? So I talked to my husband over lunch, and I said, what do you think? What if I just run for something if they need me? Okay, that's what I said. What if I just run for a position if they need me? And he said, well, okay, 10 minutes to 5, there's 9 of us standing on the courthouse steps, And I'm thinking, okay, I don't have to run for anything. And Dick Zimmelman, who is the mayor who is presently in office, and he's in his 2nd term, he said, Patty, you have to run for mayor. The incumbent had just walked by and she refused to say what she was running for. And he says, you've got to run for mayor. It's like, Dick, I'm not running for mayor. And he says, well, Patty, it's you or Nick Todd. And I'm like, who's Nick Todd? And it was the man that was standing right next to Dick. And I wasn't meaning to be offensive to anyone, but I said, at least, I have name recognition. I mean, I grew up in the town. I've been active in the community. So, the thought was going through my head, maybe I have to run for mayor. We all file into the auditor's office. It's now 5 o'clock. There's 9 of us in there, and she locks the door, okay? And Deborah Adams, who is the incumbent, is up there, and she's shielding her paper, writing down what she's running for. And I don't know how many of you know anything about public law, public disclosure laws, but once that document is handed in, it's no longer secret. So the very first question I asked once Deborah had handed it in to the clerk was, well, what position did she run for? And she said, mayor. And Dick's behind me, you got to do it, Patty, you got to do it. And so I filed for mayor. That was quite a shock when I got home, needless to say, right? Dick shared with me a few days later, because there's no going back once you've filled it out. He had a really good laugh, and he said, Patty, if you hadn't filed, I was going to run. So, like I say, you too can be mayor next year. Now, I have to tell you why I ran, okay? Obviously, this was an issue. But now's the time to share a little philosophy with you. And that is, I campaigned on a couple of different issues. One was taking back our country one community at a time, starting with Quincy. Okay, that sounds like a radical approach. But what I was talking about was getting rid of politicians and replacing them with real people. There are very few real people that are in public office, people that represent people. And people who have no representation, like in my community where we were 50% Hispanic, we're now 66%. The other one I campaigned on is Washington State's Public Disclosure Act. And it says that it's not up to an elected official to decide what's good for you to know or not to know. It's your right to know. And that was part of my ads that went into the paper. The other philosophy, and I should share it because I shared it over dinner, but part of my campaign speech had to do with the rising difference between, or the growing difference between the haves and the have-nots. And when you have those, large differences, especially in communities that have, large racial population differences, you have the potential for increased racial tensions, for crimes against people and property. And so in many ways, I was putting my Christian values to work by doing for the least of your brothers, right? And rising them up and closing that gap. So those are kind of some of the philosophies, and I think that kind of gives you a little heads up on maybe why I lost my re-election, but no, that had nothing to do with it. I have to kind of make a long story short, so I'm trying to, figure out which ones of these things I shouldn't tell you about and which ones I should just kind of give you I'm just going to flash a few things at you here. I'm in office, right? Dennis and I used to talk every day, every single day. I mean, we shared philosophies. Every time something came out in the news, like the deformed frogs, right? We were on the phone with those people. Look at the fertilizer, right? Tobacco. Where did the cadmium and the nickel and the radium-226 and the other things in tobacco come from? Right? Didn't come out of the ground. It had to have been coming from someplace. Anyway, it came from the fertilizer. We were always philosophizing about different things. And when I got into office, I had other focuses. We were redeveloping our downtown and writing grants for the pool and different things. And so there were a few years there where maybe not a lot was getting done on this issue like it should have been. But we did venture out, and we decided that we were going to test everyone. Oh, that is not going to work very well, is it? We were going to test everyone that lived on the farms that had bad fertilizer, okay, the Whitties, the DeYoungs, and the Giroux. We were going to test all of them, their children, and in the case of the Whitties, they decided to test the hair on their dogs and their cows. Okay, so we had a broad sampling of hair analysis for different heavy metals. And we decided we were going to use my son Eric, who at the time was 5, and we were going to test his hair because we didn't live on a farm, right? We live in town. Not thinking at the time that essentially we lived amongst the farms, right? And to our surprise, Eric had some very high metals. The mercury stood out, okay? And the lead was high, and the cadmium, I think that's cadmium right there. Is it? Was also high. And my husband said, to make sense of this, Patty, we should probably test our house dust. And he asked me, he says, what do you think we should test the house dust for? And I said, well, I think we should test it for what was high in Eric's hair. That seemed to make sense to me. If it was really coming from the environment, then we should see like high points in our house dust. And we tested the house dust. Oh. Excuse me, did I tell you I come from a small town in Washington State where we don't have these technological advanced pieces of equipment? I haven't even mastered the old type yet. Anyway, Eric's mercury is 200 to 500 times what the background level in Quincy should be. That number, that 10.5, is extremely high. That could be, somebody could have dropped a mercury thermometer down one of the vents in the house. There could be a lot of reasons, but that mercury is extremely high, okay? And for those of you that may not know this, contaminants outside of your home or outside of a building concentrate in the building at a factor of 10. Okay, so in our case, we should have seen cadmium at about 1 part per million, because in the basin, the average content in the soil is less than 0.1, but we're seeing higher levels than would be expected in our house dust. Okay, the same is true with the zinc. The zinc is pretty well off the chart here, and there was one other one on here. Well, and the titanium. You shouldn't see a lot of titanium. One of the things that was suspected, anecdotal evidence, rumor in town, had it that waste from the International Titanium Plant 30 miles away in Moses Lake had been brought to Quincy, and that 2 weeks after that rinsate pond had been built, it was full to the brim with a fluorescent green material that when someone that was standing next to it was asked what was in the rinsate pond, they replied, money. Okay? And that was one of the things we looked for when we went out and tested soils. We looked for titanium. But that waste in particular was radioactive. Okay, now you remember I'm in office. We just did all this testing, and as much as I'd really like to make this a really short story, I have to tell you about going to Washington, D.C., okay? I skipped one little piece here. in 1996, in September, there was a movement from in my own administration by the administrative assistant to discredit me. Okay, there was a document that was written that was obviously written by an attorney, and it accused me of being a party to harassment in the front office. Okay, and I recognized that I was working with farmers who had no credibility in the community whatsoever, and that the only one of us that had credibility was me, and if I lost it, you would never know about this issue. Okay, it would have clouded the whole issue. And so it was in September of 1996 that we took this information to Duff Wilson of the Seattle Times. Now, I expected Duff, you know, not knowing anything. Did I tell you I'm from a small town in Washington State, you know? I expected that he had nothing else on his plate, you know. I mean, he's an investigative reporter, right? They're always looking for stories. They'd have nothing else they were doing. Anyway, I expected he would get right on this. Well, he did have other stories. He got married. He took a month off, you know, and we just know that he's on the scene and that we're okay now, right? So I ventured out with Nancy Whitty, Tom Whitty, one of the farmers. I ventured out with her to Washington, D.C. to attend the first ever Children's Environmental Health Conference. And what's important about this conference and why I don't want to leave it out of the story is because I learned so much there. And I went with the intent of learning about these chemicals and the potential health effect. You know, that whole list of chemicals we saw, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, the lead, everything. And I wanted to learn about their health effects on children because this rinsate pond and these chemical companies sit right next to the junior high school. Okay? And so I went to gain information about these chemicals. And what I learned at this conference was that since 1980, okay, and this was 1997, since 1980, there had been a rise in children's cancers at 1% per year, and they would continue to rise at that rate. Okay? The childhood asthma is up 142% with increased asthma deaths at about 50%. That 1 out of every 6 children, 19% of all the children, no, 17% of all the children under the age of 19 have some form of developmental disability. Okay? That birth defects are rising, and that, you know, other childhood problems are increasing. And coincidentally, this practice kind of got started in like 1976. So I was really interested in the stuff I was learning at this conference. And the first morning, and as I explained to some kids earlier today, if you knew me 7 years ago, seeing me stand here without my knees shaken and, you know, teetering up here would be hard to believe, probably. But at this conference, Carol Browner, who was the administrator of the EPA at the time, had just given the keynote. And Nancy Whitty's sitting next to me, and she says, "Patty, you got to go up there and, you know, and ask the question." It's like, I'm not going up there. I mean, there's 300 people in this room, right? 2 rows of microphones. She says, "You got to go." And it's like, I'm not going up there. My plan was to learn as much as I could, and then on the very last day, you know, kind of explain to people what this was all about. And finally, at her insistence, you know, I'm up before one of the microphones, and I am just sure that everybody can hear my heart trying to leap out of my chest. Have you ever had that sensation where it's, you know, pumping really loud? And I said to Carol Browner, I said, I'm a mayor from a small community in Washington State, small agricultural community in Washington State, and I know that the EPA is focused on pesticides, because that's some of the trouble that NEVA and NCAP were stirring up at the time. And I said, but what are they doing about hazardous waste and fertilizer? And a silence fell over the room. There's people in the front row, the regulators are all sitting there like this, and everybody else is like, what is she talking about? And Carol Browner says, well, it all depends on what crops you're talking about. The next thing I know is this microphone goes flying to the side. Nancy Whitty, who stands a foot shorter than me, is standing right next to me. I had no idea. She goes, what crops? Peas and beans and corn. And, you know, I grabbed this microphone back, trying to maintain, you know, this credibility that I thought I was having here at the microphone. And I said, you know, ever since the EPA adopted RCRA, and you know RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, you know it as Reduce, Reuse, Recycle, the 3 R's. Ever since they had adopted that 26 of the states at this time, 1997, had adopted these pollution prevention plans, which allowed recycling of hazardous waste. And Carol Browner said something, and I have really no idea what it was, and she walked away leaving me standing at that microphone. Now, the good news is that for 3 days, everybody in that room, other than the regulatory agents who believed we were talking about sewage sludge, okay, you all know we're not talking about sewage sludge, right? Everyone at that conference came up and wanted information from us. They wanted to know what we were talking about, because these were public health officials from all 50 states who in the front lines are seeing health consequences on children. They're seeing sick children, unexplained, knowing it's environmental, but not knowing what's causing it. The EPA said that the probable cause of these the probable cause of the problems with children's health is environmental toxins. Okay, so on the one hand, they know it's causing the problems, and on the other hand, they're allowing literally billions of pounds of toxics to be dumped into the environment every year under the name of recycling. Well, needless to say, word got back to Quincy that the mayor had been out talking in Washington, D.C., and they didn't like it. So this is hard, again, to read. And I have a funny story to tell you about this guy. How should I do this? Do you want to read this? Do you want me to? Okay.
Does that make it?
Can you read it when it goes smaller?
Focus a little bit.
I've been trying to focus. We're not. No.
How's that?
This letter is from Billy Weber. And as she's trying to focus, I'm going to tell you a little story about this man, because you'll realize after you read the letter and after I tell you the story that there's no way he wrote the letter. Okay? Billy would come to my council meetings and he would say, you're so worried about hazardous waste and fertilizer, but what are you doing about that gas tank that's in your backyard? We had bought our house from his parents, and there was a gas tank in the yard, right? And he would insist on this. So finally, at one of the meetings, he says, well, what are you going to do about that gas tank that's in your yard? Why don't you take care of that first? And he said, you bought the house from my parents, and that gas tank was leaking when you bought it. And I said, excuse me, Billy, did you just say that the gas tank was leaking when we bought the house? And he said, yes. He said, and you've been putting gas into it ever since. And I said, well, no, Billy. I said, actually, we haven't put any gas into it or taken any gas out of it, but it's interesting that you admit that your family knew that the gas tank was leaking when we bought the house. Are you aware that we record these meetings? And he sat down. Anyway, this letter, essentially, I should give you a little bit time to read it. Or have you scanned it already while I... This was essentially the threat of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. Okay, agriculture in Washington State is very large, and this implied that not only the farmers but the food processors were behind this. Okay, and the good news is that on this particular day, it happened to be the very first day that Duff Wilson was able to make it to Quincy. Okay. So he's sitting in the front row, not recognized by anybody, sitting there frantically taking notes of all this activity. My council chambers are packed with, Department of Ecology people saying bad things to me, farmers saying bad things to me, and Duff's in the front row taking all these notes, right? Anyway, because this was potential litigation, these unfounded allegations. I just love that one. Because this was potential litigation, we removed the public, excused the public from the council chambers, and we went into executive session. So how many of you have ever gone to a city council meeting or commissioners meeting? Okay. There's only 3 times. This is your Civics 101. All right? And the journalism students, you already know this. There's only 3 times where elected officials can excuse themselves or ask the public to be excused, okay, and go into an executive session. One are personnel issues. The other is acquisition of land. That makes sense. You don't want to drive up the price of land. And the third one is potential litigation. So we excused ourselves into executive session. The city attorney was there, the city's insurance agent was there, and the city council were there. And essentially what happened behind those closed doors was that unless I shut up, the council, the city, and the city's insurance agency would not stand behind me if we were sued. I would not be indemnified, I would not be insured against the threat of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. And it was the first time in my life that I ever panicked. Okay? Because the only thing I could think of was I was thinking, I'm going to lose my home. All the things I've worked for, I'm going to lose it all. In the back of my mind, I thought, but I can also be quiet because I handed all this information off to the Seattle Times, so people are going to know, okay? Because it was very important to me that I had knowledge that the people had a right to know, right? My campaign issue on right to know. And so I didn't have a problem saying I'd be quiet. For the journalism students and others that have gone to a city council meeting and you've seen a group be excused and then come back into session, the part that I didn't remember, because I panicked, was that in order for them to have taken action like that, it required a vote, and you can't take any votes behind closed doors. And I could have saved myself a lot of agony, if I had just remembered that one point. Anyway, I agreed to shut up, or at least to consider shutting up at this point. And the council called a special meeting because they wanted to make sure that I did shut up, I think. And this brought about 150 to 200 people to our council chambers, and we adjourned and went down the street into the basement of Patty McGrew's, where the threat there was citizens, people that I knew that I grew up with, asking me to resign. They wanted me out of office. They wanted me to shut up. And that particular night, I was so tired. I quickly drafted up a little blurb that explained why I had done what I had done. Community right to know, the mission statement of the City of Quincy, which is protect the health and safety of the welfare of the people. It was consistent with other laws. And I handed that document over. The last part of the statement is that, I never anticipated that it would meet with resistance from the farmers or from members of the community. And so I agreed to be quiet. Okay? As I told the group earlier today, if that had been the 1800s, they would have taken me outside and strung me up. That's how hostile the environment was in the basement of Patty McGrew's. I had to call Duff Wilson, the author of the investigative series, the author of the book, eventually the book. I had to call him the next day and tell him that he couldn't mention my name or anything in his articles. And it was never to have been about me. I mean, I was the mayor of a small community that's agriculture, right? And I told him going into this could not be about Quincy. Because it was broader than Quincy. It was the state of Washington, and it was, the United States. And I told him, he could not use my name in any way, shape, or form, that I had promised to be quiet. And Duff said an interesting thing to me. He said, "Can they do that?" And I said, "What do you mean, can they do that if they did it?" He says, No, I mean, can they do that? Can they take away your constitutional rights to free speech? And there went that light again. And it was like, my gosh, no, they can't, can they? And one thing I learned, and I share this with you just because, you know, you can think about it, it happens in everyday commitments you'll make sometimes. But contract law says that for a contract to be valid, both sides of it have to be legal, right? So I had promised to be quiet based on the assumption that they could, you know, require me to be quiet. So needless to say, once I realized that contract was not valid, I haven't stopped talking. They knew they couldn't keep me quiet. So what they asked instead was they tried to barter with me. Basically, if I wouldn't talk to the media, they wouldn't talk to the media, right? What a deal we got for you. And one of the things here was make a statement of your trust in the appropriate government agencies and their ability to deal with both the Cenex situation and the waste and fertilizer issue. Like I'm going to do that. Once they knew I wasn't going to be quiet, it went from a point of denial. And this was industry's strategy from the beginning, was deny it, okay? And you saw that in the letter, the unfounded allegations. On their website, by the way, you won't find this anymore. It's the top one that's of interest. Several news stories have left readers and viewers with the impression fertilizer manufacturers take hazardous waste from industrial generators and put it in fertilizer as a cheap way of disposing of this waste for the generator. Not true. In fact, such a practice would not only be unethical, but also illegal. Now, you know what they say about there's always a little bit of truth. That statement is, in light especially of the federal lawsuit we filed against the US EPA in October, I believe that statement to be very true, both unethical and illegal. So first they denied it, okay? Then they decided, because it was getting out, and they knew it was getting out, that they would just prove its safety, right? So this is Metals in Food, the contribution of the natural abundance and soil amendments to dietary intake by Dr. Alan Felsot.
Oh my God.
Okay? Now, what's interesting about Alan Felsot is he claimed when he wrote this that he's a toxicologist. He's actually an entomologist. He studies insects. Okay? And what's even more interesting is he was paid by the Northwest Food Processors Association $5,000 to write the study. What I've since learned in my research is that he conveniently left out dietary arsenic for the last 12 years, and that arsenic in the diet has risen. It's risen in the diets of 2-year-olds and 60 to 65-year-olds. Since 1986, it's up 50% in those two age groups. And the dietary arsenic of 2-year-olds now approaches the upper limit of safety established by the World Health Organization. Okay, just conveniently, he just left that out of his report. The state did some testing of potatoes. Oh my gosh. Of potatoes. And the World Health Organization likes to see potatoes with 50 parts per billion or less. So when you get up into the 50s and 55s and things like that, and the 68 down here, those are higher than what would be acceptable. But the State Department of Health, you can't read this and I apologize, but down here they said basically it's okay. But that approval, that seal of approval by the Washington State Health was based on a 70-kilogram man, okay, not on children. And what I was going to tell you that I had learned at that Children's Health Conference and in other research that I've done is that children consume on average 2 to 3 times as much lead, arsenic, mercury, and cadmium every day in their diets. Yes, you have heavy metals in your diets every day from the food you're eating. They consume 2 to 3 times as much as teens and adults. okay? And the problem with that is that children are more vulnerable to those toxins. They don't clear them out of their bodies as quickly. They're going through rapid periods of development, and those exposures at those critical times are very damaging. And obviously, the smaller the organism, the more vulnerable the organism. So developing fetuses are the most vulnerable. Nobody looks at the diets of pregnant women. They are starting to look at the diets of pregnant women. That's where the fish advisories are coming out, okay, because of mercury in fish. Half of all your dietary mercury comes from grains and meats, okay? But infants and toddlers and developing fetuses are the most vulnerable to the toxins. And when they reviewed this, they did not review the consumption in light of an infant who would have only been able to take in, I think I figured 9 ounces of potatoes, a little bit over a half a pound, before they would have exceeded their daily tolerable intake of cadmium. Oh, and I should tell you, when I called Denise Laflamme about that and asked her, well, you know, you didn't even look at this from the standpoint of infants and toddlers. She's the toxicologist with the State Department of Health. Her response to me was, I told them not to use those numbers. And I said, you told who? The Department of Ag. You know, so here it says the State Department of Health approved this as being safe, and then they never did. So the state's done their analysis, the industry's, you know, proving it's safe, so the EPA has to get in the act, and they have to also say that it's safe. So they do a review of fertilizers, and I put this here, basically, these are the data gaps, okay? They admit in here that they don't know how much of the fertilizer market is waste-derived. And yet, they're about ready to arrive at a conclusion of safety without that much needed data. Okay, they don't know how much of it's waste-derived. Home garden fertilizers, that it suggests that significant amounts of metals are coming, you know, that people that are home gardening are being exposed to significant amounts of metals. They're not looking at multiple applications of fertilizer a year. How many of you are from agricultural communities? So you know they fertilize in the fall, they fertilize in the spring, they use zinc, they use a liming material, you know, and a host of other products, that it's not just one application per year. And essentially, when the EPA's risk assessment is done, they arrive at a conclusion of little risk. And they haven't looked at soil to plant uptake. Now, don't you think that'd be kind of important to determine if this is safe? They don't look at a groundwater migration pathway, so if if the water is contaminated, that's not an exposure pathway to you. They don't look at the lifetime cancer risks to children, which would seem to me very important, especially since there's an executive order by President Clinton that requires that anytime they set a standard, that they look at children's health. So that's kind of what the agencies were doing while I was in office. And ultimately, as it came close to my running for office, there were letters to the editor. You know, one that was sincere acts can harm. You know, Patty Martin, our mayor, was obviously very concerned, but she went about it the wrong way, and she's harmed our community, divided the community. On our Farmer Consumer Awareness Days, which is our annual celebration in town, they specifically asked to have the booth next to me so they could hand out propaganda. After people had come to me, then they could hand out with their free potato chips propaganda so that people could read that. And they actually had a meeting and sent all their employees, all the fertilizer employees, door to door campaigning against me prior to the primary. I lost, we were talking about this over dinner, I only lost by 50 votes, right, in the primary. But what was interesting is after one of these meetings, and it was the one where I, said that to Billy Weber about, we record these meetings. The next day, George Nutter, who was one of the mayoral candidates, came in and he said, we gave you a 9 for your debating skills. And when he said that, I knew there would not be a primary debate. They scheduled the primary debate for a week after the primary. So I'm out of office, okay? That's kind of where you find me today. And what I wanted to do next, I can take some questions from you if you want to do that now about all of what happened there and kind of the personal side of this, or I can go right into what I'm talking about, which is the disposal of hazardous waste and fertilizer, where the sources of these materials are, what kind of contaminants we're talking about. You want me to go there and then just save questions to the end? Okay. You know the big smokestacks that are on industry? They're sent high in the sky so that these materials, these contaminants, are dispersed, broadly instead of right down on the people that live close by. Well, those smokestacks have contaminants that'll be lined inside of them, so they'll be scrubbed like with an acid and washed down. They also have filters on them that capture the pollutants. Well, those same pollutants that they're capturing that have lead and cadmium and mercury and arsenic and dioxin and thallium and vanadium and, you can look at almost the whole periodic chart, are taken, and because they have NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, or they have one of the 13 micronutrients like zinc, selenium, boron, molybdenum, chlorine, manganese, magnesium, copper. I know I missed a couple. But because they contain one of those, they can be sold as a micronutrient fertilizer or as a nutrient fertilizer, the NPK. All right? Regardless of what's tagging along. So we know that coal-fired power plant wastes are marketed in this way. They do designate as a hazardous waste, but the EPA refuses to regulate them as such. So they move all around the country without much tracking. And they're typically used as liming agents. They have a very high pH. In Washington and Oregon, we know that nuclear fuel processing waste, okay, that is deemed safe because it's less radioactive than naturally occurring phosphate rock, is for sale as an ammonium nitrate. Okay, that's a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's, it's less radioactive than mining waste. There's one particular one out of Humboldt, Arizona called ironite that's marketed in all 50 states, or it was until Maine enforced their statutes and regulations with a little help from a friend. And now it's no longer for sale in Maine. Pulp and paper industries, which are heavy in arsenic and dioxin. Film processing wastes, aluminum wastes. There's just brass foundries. There was one waste that was coming to Quincy, coming from Connecticut, being shipped all the way across the country from a place called Exeter Tire Incinerators. And it was incinerated tires being sold as a zinc micronutrient. Incinerated tires on your food. Okay, so hopefully you're getting the picture that any waste that has a micronutrient or a nutrient source could be disposed in this manner. Some of the home garden products that the Seattle Times tested, oh yeah, it's not going to work well, I apologize. The levels on here, some of them are in the 4,000 and 5,000 parts per million of lead and arsenic. This practice has been around for a very long time. Back in the early 1920s, I believe it was, an example of a recycling like this, a use of a waste product would be lead arsenate. Are you familiar with lead arsenate? It was used in orchards as an insecticide. What it was a waste product from the gold mining industry. 50 years after it was banned, okay, it was banned in like 1950. 50 years later, we're still dealing with the contamination of lead and arsenic on these properties. Okay, it's kind of an example of we should have learned a lesson and not allow something like this to continue on. The RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act that I mentioned, reduce, reuse, recycle, its primary function was to reduce the amount of hazardous waste generated. That's why it was implemented in 1976, was to reduce the amount of hazardous waste generated, to recycle what could be recycled, and when the thought of recycling was supposed to be in process, okay, never to ground, and to reuse other commodities. The RCRA specifically banned the land application of hazardous waste. 1984, Congress comes back in and they slap EPA's hand. They say, you haven't done your job, you haven't enforced the statutes in RCRA, and now we're giving you an ultimatum. Okay, and they created what's called the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments of 1984. Within 1 year of that ultimatum, which would set specific guidelines, timelines for the EPA, within 1 year, EPA had inserted into regulation a loophole that allowed hazardous waste to be disposed as fertilizers. Okay? Now, kind of back to that Civics 101, just to make sure people understand this, is elected bodies like state legislators and congressmen vote, and they create statutes, they create laws. And those statutes give authority to regulatory agencies like the Department of Ag or Department of Ecology or Department of Justice or whomever. It gives them the authority for the rules. And then the rules have to be consistent with the statutes, correct? And that's part of our lawsuit that we're bringing, is this inconsistency between the regulation and the enabling statutes. What I'd like you to do is pretend that you're the Congress of the United States, right? And I've come into you and I have this plan, and I would like to dispose of hazardous waste as fertilizer on your food supply. Okay? All in favor say aye. Or raise your hands, right? Anybody? Okay, that's the point. Did the Congress of the United States take a vote that allows the disposal of hazardous waste as fertilizer? If they didn't, it's not legal. Right? That the statutory authority is just not there. So that's a piece of what a very simplistic analysis of that. Yes or no, will it show up? Okay. The problems with this method of disposal is this practice has never been proven safe. Okay, the courts have held that the administrator of the EPA must affirmatively find that a disposal method is safe before they allow it. Okay, they don't have to find that it's unsafe to prohibit it, but they must have an affirmative finding of safety in order to allow it. It's not been proven safe, and the standards that they use, if these materials, these hazardous wastes are clean enough to put into a lined hazardous waste landfill. Okay, this is the piece you have to, when you get quizzed by your teachers tomorrow, this is the piece you need to know. If they're clean enough to put into a lined hazardous waste landfill that has, groundwater monitoring stations, the air is being monitored, somebody's paid to make sure it gets cleaned up properly. If it's clean enough to go in there, it's clean enough to dispose of it on your food supply. And those standards were never designed to predict crop uptake, groundwater contamination, the fugitive dust, or soil accumulation. The burden of proof on this falls on the farmers. Falls on the farmers. When these farmers lost their crops, the burden of proof was on them to prove that what was in that material harmed their crops. Okay, that's the burden of proof on the wrong side of the scale of justice. It needs to be where it belongs under the RCRA, which is on the generator of the wastes. RCRA also requires that there's a cradle-to-grave accountability on any hazardous waste you generate. So, the question is, are farms hazardous waste landfills? That's a decision that we anticipate we'll be asking the court to decide. There's anonymity for the generator of the waste. Look on a bag of fertilizer, okay? The biggest loophole is on the bagged fertilizers, because they don't have to account for it coming to each one of your home gardens or onto school property or onto the golf courses or whatever. So that's where the concern from EPA was even expressed that some of these metal concentrations may actually be higher in home garden products. But look on that bag and you won't see anything about who generated the waste. Okay, you won't see anything about the contaminants that are in, potentially in that material. Now that's not to say that all bagged fertilizers are waste derived. Some of them are, and I would suggest that you can go onto the Washington State Department of Ag's website and look at some of the metal contents in these fertilizers. But when you look at a bag of fertilizer and you see, 555, 15, and there has to be 100% of something in that bag, that's 85% of it unaccounted for, right? When you see the NPK, you got to think no public knowledge, right? What if they'd put some other letters up there? I'd be in trouble, wouldn't I? And then the harm isn't going to be evidence for years off of this. I believe what we're seeing in the way of children's health problems right now is the tip of the iceberg, and that children, in fact, are that canary in the mine shaft. That they're is the word harbinger of things to come. So, what are you going to do about it?
Grow clover.
Grow clover? I don't remember who said this, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And this is a little talk on democracy, okay? A democratic government is maintained when people participate. Okay, democracy is a participatory form of government, and when you give your power to elected officials and fail to involve yourself, this kind of stuff is what happens, okay? Because absolute power, knowing that the people aren't looking over your shoulder, corrupts absolutely. I wanted to take back the government starting with Quincy. Who would have thought that I'd be standing talking about hazardous waste and fertilizer, giving you a lecture on democracy? But I know from my time in office, the only time I heard from somebody was when they were mad at me. By then the damage is done. The laws have been passed, the ordinances, whatever's going on. I would encourage you to call your representatives, to call your senators, and introduce yourself, and let them know you're going to be watching over their shoulder. The last thing that an elected official, even having people I worked for the people, but even having people in my council chambers made me a little bit nervous, okay? They never had anything nice to say, But get to know the elected officials, let them know that the environment's important to you. Let them know you're going to be watching over their shoulders, okay? Make it a point to support the people that you know are good elected officials, and get the ones that are bad, that don't represent your interests, get them out of office. This is from the Bible. I don't remember exactly where it's at, but he who silent consents. You've heard that before, that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And we have a problem. Montana uses 1.1 billion pounds of fertilizer a year. Okay, Washington State uses 2.4 billion pounds of fertilizer a year. Nationally, and they don't include 4 states that are major agricultural states like Texas, Iowa, Ohio, and one other one. But there's 110 billion pounds of fertilizer consumed annually in the country. Every 1 part per million, just to put this into numerical, understand numbers, 1 part per million is 110,000 pounds of lead, of cadmium, of mercury, of whatever, just dispersed into the environment every year. And now we are 23 years or more past the point where this really, started in, and what kind of residuals do we have out there? Okay? If you think about that bag of fertilizer I told you, and less than 50% of it is identified, that would mean that over 55 billion pounds of potentially toxic, certainly non-nutrient materials are dumped into the environment every year through this practice. These metals that I'm talking about, the lead and the mercury and the cadmium, are called toxic for a reason, and that is they are very harmful to human health in very, very small doses. Okay? I'm open to questions. I appreciate your listening. You kind of got many, many years into a nutshell.
Clarification, Farmer Dennis was sued by Cenex and they won?
Yes.
And was the pretext that he was responsible for cleaning up his land?
No, the pretext was that he owed them money on chemicals that he had used. And what had happened was he did owe them money, and when he gave up his land was valued at more than $250,000 more than what he owed them. But they just needed to shut him up. When Dennis, it's interesting that when Dennis tried to get a change of venue and get out of the county, you know, away from the two judges we had, he couldn't get out of the county, so they brought a particular judge in, and I predicted who the judge would be because he was one of the people I was monitoring during my time with the city, or, you know, overseeing the city government. So Dennis got this judge, and then when Duke Giroux's court case was held, he got a change of venue into this judge's court. Okay? And there's a connection here between attorneys and schedulers of the court. But you cannot have, in my opinion, the industry could not afford to have a successful lawsuit. Yeah. In fact, there were over 13 different reasons for a mistrial, including that the woman that was on the jury had a cell phone with her, a laptop computer in the jury room, and was a credit service person for Cenex. But they denied the mistrial. Yes? The federal, yeah, the lawsuit was originated by Safe Food and Fertilizer, and we invited the California Public Interest Research Group, the Family Farm Defenders out of Wisconsin, and the Oregon Toxics Alliance to be co-plaintiffs with us. Yes. The court date should be, the brief is due at the end of April, and then the court date is probably October. It's in the DC Court of Appeals. The DC Court of Appeals is the only court that can hear claims against a federal agency or interpret federal statute. Yes?
I have a comment and then a question. Just, he was uttering some, you were laughing when you talked about Alan Felsot because he came to Missoula, he was hired by the Forest Service, and the wheat district here and several agencies to come and tell us how safe all the pesticides are that they were using. And it was the same situation. They paid him a lot of money to do a very big study, and his study was so bad, he had completely unsaturated claims, and just his whole thing was just appalling. So you were sort of surprised to see him being trotted around all over.
Yeah, I did hear some snickering. I was wondering, kind of expected to be coming from over here, but you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's been involved in a number of things where he does this. Just to add one thing, Duff Wilson says in his book, because I think you'll appreciate this, he actually doesn't quote Felsot in the stories that he wrote because he had been paid to produce this study. Felsot was furious.
No.
Why wasn't I in the story? Which is, I mean, you know, it says a lot to me.
So the question I had too is that last legislative session, one of our staff was a state legislator, Gail Gucci, and she had tried to introduce a bill to get at least to get labeling on fertilizer here the farmers would know, and it was a hugely contentious issue. And of course, the same sort of accusations, this would ruin agriculture in Montana if we actually required labeling on fertilizer. So I'm wondering if you managed to get the labeling laws changed in Washington State.
One, you always have to be careful what you ask for. Okay? First, if it's not legal, do you want to ask for labeling? Okay, in my state, it wasn't legal at the time that we disclosed, you know, that we uncovered this, we exposed it. And in Montana, in anticipation of coming, I did a little research on your what's going on in your state. And your Department of Ag, in October of this year, of 2002, just adopted the APCO rules. Okay, I brought along a letter that's from the EPA that opposes the adoption of the APCO rules because they'll allow like 16,000 parts per million lead in fertilizer and 3,000 parts per million cadmium. Remember what I told you about 1 part per million, how much that is going to be when you put it out there? And they adopted those rules without any public comment. They got 7 comments, and they were all from the fertilizer industries. You have a requirement, someplace I read, you have a requirement for them to solicit input from the stakeholders, including environmental groups, and there was no, they didn't solicit any comments. And the reason for putting this rule in place, I thought you'd all enjoy this. Although the distribution of an adulterated fertilizer or soil amendment is prohibited within the statutes of the Montana Commercial Fertilizers Act, adulteration is not defined. Okay? This is October 2002. Adulteration is not defined. The inclusion of this rule defines adulteration of fertilizers or soil amendments by heavy metals. Okay? So, you couldn't adulterate them, but now you can adulterate them up to 13,600 and some odd parts per million lead. And until you get to the 600 and something and 1, it's not adulterated. This is your Department of Ag working on your behalf. Okay? In my opinion, working without statutory authority, right? Because they very clearly here say that it's prohibited. Adulteration is prohibited within the statutes. They didn't go, your agricultural, your fertilizer laws on your books, the last change to them were in like 1975. Okay? So your legislature did not vote to allow heavy metals to go into fertilizer. Okay? There was a bill, House Bill 31 that I looked at that could possibly be interpreted that they're allowing non-nutrient contaminants in fertilizer because they're requiring that it be disclosed on the registration label. But your Department of Ag, as well as your Department of Ecology, have been very busy working behind the scenes to make sure that this practice is legal, or at least in regulation in the state of Montana. You had not adopted the federal regulation in this state until a month before this one. Let me make it really clear to you that you can have a federal regulation. Okay, let's back up. The RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. States are required under this statute, it's a very good statute. Okay, the best thing to do is enforce the statute, seek enforcement whenever possible, don't try to change it. The Congress said that states have to have at a minimum, you have to have the minimum environmental standards that are established under the RCRA. Okay, so hazardous waste has to be disposed in a lined hazardous waste landfill. But they left it to the states to be more stringent, right? Because controls and protections to the citizens should be the goal that's closest to the people, right? The objective of the people who are elected are closest to the people. So states can have more stringent regulations. Now, that means that you can have a federal regulation that a state doesn't adopt, right? You could put something on the books that's more stringent than that. So in the case of Montana, you had not adopted the federal regulation that allows this method of disposal. I have that document here too. Actually, I think she has it now, but they didn't adopt that federal regulation until September of 2002. Again, the question would be whether or not there was statutory authority from your state legislature authorizing them to do that. I notice at the end of both of these documents, you must have a provision under you have the tail end of that one?
That's all of it.
There's something on the end of each one of these things, and I haven't had time to look it up, and I apologize, but it says, number 7, it says the bill sponsor notice requirements of 24302 of the MCA do not apply, as though maybe there is some need for your legislature to then adopt by a vote rules. Some legislatures require that. So something's been circumvented here. I thought I'd look into it and find out. So I'm going to tell you, go after your Department of Ag. Your Department of Ecology. These people aren't working for you. They're, these are not good rules they just put in place. Other questions? Yes?
Just to clarify, Patty, you mentioned the first response of the industry was denial,
Mm-hmm.
and then they went to the dietary studies. Have they admitted explicitly that they are using hazardous materials in fertilizer, or is that still part of what's being contested?
No, there really is not any discussion now that these materials are being used because they've been found, they've been identified. Not all the waste streams are known, but many of them. And without going into this, some of these things are hazardous wastes, and other ones are non-hazardous, and that was some of the confusion I think that ended up happening in the book on that legality piece. States typically manage the non-hazardous wastes, and then whether or not they've chosen to regulate the hazardous ones are different. But I just said I didn't want to go there. I should keep my word. Excuse me.
Is there any link to disorders such as ADHD to hazardous waste fertilizer?
I'm glad you asked that question. I had a woman contact me. Her name is Teresa Binstock. She had gotten a grant from the Autism Research Institute to look at chelation data. Does everybody know what chelation is? Chelation is something that naturopaths will do. So if you've got heavy metal exposures, they will either give you an IV or you can take an oral chelator. And these chelating agents have a higher affinity for the metals than your liver does or your kidney does. And so when you have these materials in your body, they bind to the metals, and then they're passed out through your urine. Well, she got this grant to look at this chelation data. And, everyone's concerned about the mercury in vaccines. And so they anticipated that they would have all the information they needed from this chelation data. They'll find tons of mercury, right? Well, they did. They found mercury. But they also found lead and arsenic and antimony and tin and aluminum and thallium and strontium and uranium. And a month later, she read Fateful Harvest. And that's when she contacted me. And, she's telling everybody about it. Because, there are very few places where children can be getting heavy metals. It's basically what you're drinking, what you're breathing, and what you're eating, right? And so some of the information that she's been bringing forward indicates that the autistic children and other children with like the ADHD, and ADD and all the rest, have an inability to clear these metals from their system, and it just causes, just havoc with their nervous systems and their brains. And when they are chelated, many of these children, their symptoms improve. Where do you go to find a chelator? Find a naturopath. Yeah, I've got a number of them that are members of Safe Food and Fertilizer. In fact, that's one of the things. They're a long way away from you, but I want to get their information on the website. Who asked that? No, it's www.safefoodandfertilizer.org. Yeah, and please keep checking back because it's about ready to undergo some changes. We're putting the Washington State Department of Ag as well as the Department of Ecology's web database, fertilizer database on our website. And the information, the explanation on how this is supposed to be regulated and how it is being regulated will also be up there. So do check back. It's a homely site. Go ahead.
So how is your community responding to you now? What's happening? It's all like they weren't coming up with it at one point. Has that changed? Have they gotten over their emotions? Are they actually dealing with what you brought up?
There are just some people you just don't talk to about it, And there are other people that really want to learn more. It's obvious to many people there's something wrong. And I think that's not just in Quincy. I think it's obvious to people everywhere that something's not right. And as I was explaining in one of the classes earlier, in our town, I know of a husband and wife that both have MS. Okay, MS is linked to cadmium. And there's a lot of cadmium in these fertilizers, the waste-derived ones. A husband and wife with Parkinson's disease. And we recently had a husband and wife both die of multiple myeloma, which is a rare blood cancer. and you just don't have husbands and wives. I mean, husbands and wives are reflections of environmental exposures, because they have nothing hereditarily in common.
All right, so what is your group in the Safe Food Fertilizer? What's your main strategy today?
What's our main strategy to date?
Yeah.
Bring the federal lawsuit, ban the practice. Identify, hopefully to be able to identify places where potential suits could be brought against some of the generators of the waste. I mean, there is no liability to these generators, and that's what the RCRA was all about. It was about, creating a system of accountability, of liability, financial responsibility to the generators of wastes. And so we just have to do it a little bit different, take a different tact. And public education is a big part of it, okay? That everyone that, I believe that now that you know about this, you have the same responsibility that I do to basically right the wrong, to get involved, to tell other people about it. One of the conditions to be able to use waste-derived products, one was that they had to meet the treatment standards for disposal in a aligned hazardous waste landfill. The other one is they have to have a market. They have to have people that are willing to buy them. If you, by your consumer choices, chose fertilizers that were clean, okay, you would either force the dirty fertilizers to clean up their act, or you would force them to dispose of their materials properly. Okay, so we can drive this to a degree. Actually, we can drive it, and that's how we should be driving it, is through consumer choices.
Can you throw out some names
That are clean? Well, okay, no, when you get to my website, you're going to understand what I just meant about homely. Okay, we have a lot. I'm working with volunteers, and I've got a guy that's working on it right now. But, when you're working on volunteers, you kind of work at their pace. Let me, rather than do that, let me explain to you how to choose a good fertilizer, okay, by looking at it. All right? If they're crystalline, okay, Miracle-Gro, for example, is crystalline. Crystals, if you're taking chemistry, are pretty pure, aren't they? So crystalline fertilizers are good choices. Miracle-Gro is a crystalline fertilizer. It was one of the ones, if I could have shown that slide, that is, has very few, if any, toxins in it. All right? Ones to avoid are ones that are ashen in nature, dark, gray, black, things that represent incinerated tires or steel mill flue dust. In fact, I failed to mention the one waste stream that actually has an exemption under the law, or had until this latest rule, and that was steel mill flue dust from the flue, the air contaminant control devices of steel mills. You almost hate to mention some of these names because you're going to get yourself, there's a slap suit on one environmentalist for trying to do a consumer campaign against a particular mining waste out of Arizona. And it's sold, actually I'll mention the name, it's ironite. It has 3,000, I think it's like 3,000 parts per million lead and 3,000 parts per million arsenic. A waste would characterize any material, okay, that you wanted to test to see where you could dispose of it. If it had 15 parts per million or greater lead, that's enough to characterize something's hazardous. 2.2 parts per million cadmium is enough to characterize something as hazardous. Okay, 0.5 parts per million mercury. Okay, so we're not talking about large amounts of these materials. In fact, one of the documents that we have from the EPA, and it was for citing hazardous waste landfills next to communities, is that if you're within 8 parts per million of lead, if you're within 500 meters of 8 parts per million lead, that has, at 500 meters, has both an ecological effect and a human health effect. 8 parts per million lead at over a quarter-mile away. Okay, these materials are very toxic in very low doses. There is no safe level of exposure to lead. Other questions? Because I'll tell you, industry will play this up. They will tell you that these are just trace amounts. Okay? And I have to admit that when I first looked at this information, before I got involved in really the researching part of this, I thought, what's everybody complaining about? There's only, 300 parts per million. I mean, right, 300 parts per million out of a million millions? That doesn't sound like very much. And industry will tell you that 1 part per million is a drop of water in a big rail car. You know, 1 drop in a rail car full of... So that's how they downplay it. But they're toxic in very, very low doses, and don't, you know, have the knowledge. Knowledge is power. And don't give in to the mental games.
You said in 1997 you had your 5-year-old son's hair
Mhm.
tested for heavy metals. Have you since tested to see if any of those levels have been reduced by any chance?
No. No, in fact, at the time, he was pretty aggressive, you know. Well, I haven't. No, I've kind of come to the conclusion that, you know, essentially we live, because we live, you know, there's farm fields all around us, literally, you know, a block away in both directions from me, that we essentially live amidst a hazardous waste dump, right? If the hazardous waste have been put on the farmlands, you are living in the middle of that hazardous waste site. No, I would like to see some tests done out there, air analysis and different things, or blood levels of lead and different chemicals, because we don't have any heavy industry where I live. None. We have food processors. No heavy industry. So if you've got, you know, if you had heavy metals in your urine or your blood living in Quincy, Washington, you only got them from 2 sources, one the air or the food. You had a question here.
Yeah, I ain't thinking about baby food, but the vegetables and stuff that we give that is not declared organic, and I even wonder about some of that. Are the sources tested out for these sorts of things? Do we know the food coming in, like from Mexico and so forth, hasn't been treated in much the same way or worse, perhaps? And the other thing is, are there any studies done in terms of what global corporations might or might not be doing, what with environmental laws being much less and so forth than other countries?
You know, really the issue you're talking about is we live in a global food environment, right? I mean, food security is an issue, and we trade foods all across the board. I can't tell you what other countries do. I can tell you that Kyoko here can tell you that Japan tests all the food that comes into their country for heavy metals. Okay? They take food safety very seriously. I can tell you that the European community, you know, when they had dioxin show up in the pork, and they had you know, a couple of other issues on food safety, the people stood up. But you won't find that here. You know, as far as organics go, you know, organics is always going to be the safer alternative if for no other reason than there's no pesticides. Actually, could I take this guy right here?
Part of organics. Are the organics, like if they're going to certify organic, are they not going to be using?
Okay, there have been, and Duff discovered this, that some of the fertilizers that were going into organics were actually waste derived, and those have been, you know, the ones that have been identified have been taken out. I suspect that there's some, you know, some that have made it in there, but I don't think, you know, at all to the degree that this is happening. One of the problems with organics is that mined products, okay, are an acceptable fertilizer source, and mined phosphate rocks coming out of Idaho are heavily contaminated with cadmium, and coming out of Florida are heavily contaminated with uranium, and both sources are heavily, and I mean heavily, 15% or more contaminated with fluoride. All right? You all do know that the fluoride that goes into drinking water is phosphate fertilizer waste. Did I mention we have a waste disposal problem in this country? Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns in both areas yet. Yeah, right here.
All right, you say that the reason that, the premise of your lawsuit is back in Washington, D.C. is that because there wasn't a vote, hands raising in Congress, that's illegal. Instead, it was done through an executive order.
No, that was a simple explanation of what statutory authority means. Okay. The fact of the matter is the RCRA, that Resource Conservation and Recovery Act I talked about, provides cradle-to-grave accountability on hazardous waste. And it specifically says that hazardous waste has to be managed in a lined hazardous waste landfill, okay, or a mine or underground cave. And it gives a couple other acceptable units that contain these hazardous constituents for perpetuity, okay? And they kind of define perpetuity as like 10,000 years, that these materials will be contained and the environment will be safe. And so that's the legal piece. I was trying to give you a feel for, you know, kind of like in asking for statutory authority for something, obviously the question has never been asked to the Congress, would you like to put hazardous waste on your food? And I can't imagine that anybody in their right mind, other than the Washington State Legislature, would vote to allow that, because my legislature did vote. Anyway, I appreciate your attention and, you know, your interest in coming out, however compulsory it may have been. And, you know, if you have any questions, I'm here and I'd be happy to answer them. So thank you.
I failed to acknowledge the NSF EBSCOR program in the introduction. I want to thank them for their support to help us bring Patty out here. And thank you all for coming. Thanks, Patty, so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
That was great.
Which basketball game?
Exactly.
Oh, I'm not.
You don't even care anymore.
Oh, I do care. I've been away. They're playing, huh?
Yeah, they play,